Hey everyone, welcome back. Ready to dive into some really cool canine epilepsy research?
Definitely. It's cutting-edge stuff looking at how blood work analysis could change how we understand this condition.
Which is huge because I'm guessing a lot of our listeners probably have a personal connection to this. Epilepsy in dogs, it's not exactly rare.
It's surprisingly common, actually. And what makes it even more complex is that there's not just one type of epilepsy. We see a lot of variety in the dogs that come in.
So how do you even begin to unravel that? What makes diagnosing the specific type of epilepsy so tricky?
It's like solving a puzzle, but you don't have all the pieces. Could be genetics, breed predispositions.
Okay, so like some breeds might be more prone to it than others. Makes sense.
Exactly. But then you also have things like structural brain abnormalities, metabolic disorders.
So it's not always as simple as just looking at a dog's breed and going from there.
Not at all. And that's why accurate diagnosis is so crucial.
Because if you don't know what's causing it, you can't treat it effectively, right?
Exactly. Different types of epilepsy often require completely different treatment approaches.
Which is where this new research comes in. It's looking at blood work,
Right.
trying to find clues there.
Right on. This study focuses on finding easy-to-measure markers in the blood that could give us more insight into what's happening.
And if it pans out, it could mean simpler, faster diagnosis, maybe even less invasive for the dogs, right?
Potentially. That's the hope.
Okay, so let's talk specifics. What are these blood markers they're looking at?
The study zeroes in on two in particular, CRP, or C-reactive protein, and NLR, which stands for Neutrophil-to-Lymphocyte ratio.
Those are definitely some technical terms. Can you break those down for us? Like, what is CRP in plain English?
Think of CRP like a general inflammation marker. When there's inflammation somewhere in the body, CRP levels tend to rise.
Just like a signal flare, basically. Something's going on, pay attention.
Exactly. And then you have NLR, which is more focused on the immune response. It compares two types of white blood cells.
And what's that telling us?
Basically how the immune system is handling things. If the NLR is elevated, it could mean the immune system's working overtime, possibly fighting inflammation.
Okay, I'm following so far. But here's the thing. We're talking about epilepsy, which affects the brain. So how do these markers, which seem to be more general inflammation signals, how do they relate to what's going on in the brain specifically?
That's where things get really interesting. There's a growing body of evidence suggesting that neuroinflammation, which is inflammation in the brain, could play a significant role in epilepsy.
Wait, so you're saying inflammation in the brain might actually contribute to seizures in dogs?
That's what research is starting to point to. And that's why this particular study looking at CRP and NLR in dogs with epilepsy is so exciting.
So this study, it looked at dogs with different types of epilepsy, right? It
Yeah.
tried to see if there were any patterns with these CRP and NLR levels.
Exactly. And they actually found some pretty compelling stuff. Like with CRP, they noticed a big difference between dogs with structural epilepsy and those with idiopathic epilepsy.
Remind me again, what's the difference there?
Right. So structural epilepsy, that's when there's some kind of visible abnormality in the brain, like a lesion or something.
Ah, okay.
Whereas idiopathic epilepsy, that's when we can't find a clear structural cause.
So it's kind of like we know something's off, but we don't necessarily see it on like a scan or anything.
Yeah, think of it that way. And what they found is that the dogs with structural epilepsy, the ones with those visible brain abnormalities, they tended to have way higher CRP levels.
Interesting. So higher CRP could be a sign of something actually being like physically different in the brain.
Potentially, yeah. But here's where it gets even more interesting. Within the idiopathic epilepsy group, they also found differences in CRP levels.
Oh, wow. So even when there's no visible cause for the epilepsy, CRP might still tell us something.
Right. They looked at dogs who have isolated seizures, meaning just one at a time, versus those who have cluster seizures, which are multiple seizures happening close together.
And cluster seizures, those are generally tougher to manage, aren't they?
Absolutely. And what they discovered is that the dogs with cluster seizures, even though they had idiopathic epilepsy, their CRP levels were higher compared to the dogs with isolated seizures.
So higher CRP may be a sign of more severe epilepsy, at least in some cases.
It's possible, but it's just one study, so we need more research to be sure.
Right. Always good to be cautious. But what about NLR? What did they find with that marker?
NLR was a little less clear-cut. They found that basically all the dogs with epilepsy, whether it was structural or idiopathic, had higher NLR values than the healthy dogs.
So across the board, higher NLR if a dog had epilepsy. Interesting.
Yeah, which kind of suggests that there might be a broader inflammatory process going on in epilepsy, even if there's no obvious damage to the brain.
So inflammation's still a factor, but maybe not as directly tied to those visible brain lesions.
Right. But even though both groups had elevated NLR, there wasn't a huge difference between the idiopathic and structural groups.
So not as clear-cut as CRP when it comes to
Yeah.
differentiating between those types of epilepsy.
Yeah, we need more research on NLR to really understand its role.
Okay, so big picture, we've got these two markers, CRP and NLR, and both of them seem to be telling us something about inflammation in dogs with epilepsy, but in slightly different ways.
Exactly. And that's what's so cool about this kind of research, right? It's like we're starting to uncover new layers of understanding.
So where do we go from here? I mean, for dog owners listening, what does this actually mean? Should we be asking our vets about CRP and NLR levels?
It's definitely worth discussing with your vet, especially if you have a dog with epilepsy. But to be totally honest, these findings don't necessarily change how we're approaching things right now, at least not immediately.
Okay, so more of a long game then.
Yeah, I'd say so. This research is really exciting, but it's just one study. We need more research, bigger studies to really confirm what we're seeing.
Which is always how science works, right?
Right.
You got to be sure. But let's say down the line, this research pans out. It really does change how we diagnose epilepsy in dogs. What would that look like?
Oh, that's the really exciting part. It could totally revolutionize how we approach treatment.
Okay, I'm all ears. Tell me more.
Right now, a lot of times we end up going with what we call a one-size-fits-all approach, especially when it comes to medication.
Makes sense, I guess. You got to start somewhere.
Right. But the thing is, these anti-epileptic drugs, they work for some dogs, but not all dogs. And sometimes you have side effects. It can be a real balancing act.
So you're saying with this research, maybe we could move away from that one-size-fits-all model.
Exactly. Imagine being able to use markers like CRP and NLR along with a dog's breed, their history, any other test results to really pinpoint what's triggering their seizures.
So really personalized medicine for dogs. That's amazing.
It is pretty cool when you think about it, and it's not just about the medication either. This research really highlights how important it is to look at the whole picture when it comes to epilepsy management.
What do you mean by that?
Things like diet, exercise, even stress management, they can all play a role because they all tie back into inflammation, which, as we've been talking about, could be a big part of the puzzle here.
So it's not just about suppressing the seizures, it's about supporting the dog's overall health and well-being.
Exactly, and that's something I always try to stress with owners, too. It's a team effort.
I love that.
Yeah.
So while this research might not be changing everything overnight, it's definitely giving us a lot to think about and a lot to be hopeful for when it comes to canine epilepsy.
I couldn't agree more. It's really exciting to be in this field right now, seeing these kinds of discoveries being made.
Well, on that note, I want to say a huge thank you to you for diving into all this research with us. This has been incredibly fascinating.
My pleasure, really. It's always a good time to chat about the brain, especially when it comes to helping our furry friends live their best lives.
Couldn't have said it better myself. And to all our listeners out there, thanks for joining us on Vet Neurojar. Keep those minds working and tails wagging.